Okay, I think we're live. I think you can go ahead. Go ahead and share your screen, Geoffrey, and then we can tell whether everything's working or not.
Okay, I'm trying to share screen now.
Okay, good. We can see that. That looks perfect. Excellent.
Okay, would you like me to start or?
Yes, go ahead. We're ready. Go ahead and start.
So first of all, I'd like to thank you for organizing this, Matt, and I'd like to thank those students who have trickled in. I understand there are important things happening in Leipzig this evening, and it certainly is the case that here in North America, a lot of focus and attention is on Europe right now, especially France with the recent events. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, in this talk, I'm going to actually begin by saying a little bit about the INK project, and then I'm going to get into the substance of the talk, which is really about interface. And I'm going to start by talking about how we've gone about thinking about and studying interface, and then I'm going to sort of give an example of that with the Perseus project, and then I'm going to briefly sort of show some ideas about how we prototype interfaces, and then talk about the importance of preserving interfaces for study. Now, because I'm talking remotely and don't see anybody, in fact, you could all have left the room for all I know, I'm going to be very dependent on you, Matt. If somebody's got a question, I hope you will cough loudly or just interrupt me.
I will do that. I promise.
Great. If you see people in the front row wiggling their eyebrows, frowning, and so on like that, it's very strange talking without those contextual clues.
I agree. I agree. I will try to give you as many contextual clues as possible.
Good. Good. Okay. So let me start with the issue I want to deal with, and that's why and how do we want to study interface? And as I said before, I actually address that question, I want to give a bit of background about the INK project. The INK project is, INK stands for Imagining New Knowledge Environments. The project originally was, we used to call it sort of the human-computer interface to the book. And the project is funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which is our funding agencies for the social sciences and humanities. And it's a major collaborative research initiative, which is actually in its last year. It's coming to an end. Within that large project, and there's people from across the country and elsewhere in the world who are part of this project, we had an interface design group. And we set ourselves the task of trying to treat interfaces as serious objects of study for the digital humanities, but not simply study them retroactively or historically, but look at the way interfaces evolved in order to imagine how interfaces might be. Because we seem to be at a sort of moment of epochal change where we are shifting from print interfaces to digital interfaces, whether it's from print books to electronic books. I'm told that Amazon, for example, now sells more electronic books, at least in North America, than print books. So we're at a moment of epochal change. Mind you, for someone my age, it seems like I've been at a moment of epochal change since the beginning of my life. And every year there's a new announcement of yet another facet of the change. Nonetheless, that seemed to be what INK wanted to focus on. As we began to look at interfaces, we came from, most of us, our experience of interface design was really around the design of interfaces. Because as many of us in the digital humanities tend to focus on the building of things, the making of things. It's the digital humanities in some ways is more of a craft than an academic field. And there is a long tradition of just sort of jumping in and building it and not really caring what anybody else has done. So we had a certain amount of experience with the building of things. People like Stan Rucker, who was the director of the Interface Design Group. He is actually, his PhD is in design and English. And we had collectively a lot of experience with that. But we began to sort of think it would be interesting to look at how interfaces before the digital and see if we could get ideas from them. And we began to look around and try to track the interfaces to how certain visual interfaces had evolved even in print. And in particular, we began to look for examples of artifacts that had made the shift from print artifacts to digital artifacts. And so separately, we've actually published, I think, some interesting studies on this subject. It's very interesting to look at indices, bibliographies, different types of books or editions that have had a long life in print, and you can sort of follow how the print interface has changed, and then look at the decisions that were made when digital interfaces were implemented. And in particular, what we discovered, which was very interesting, was that in a number of projects, it wasn't the case that the digital superseded the print. What we found was situations where the digital and the print were being redesigned to run concurrently. And so projects which would have a print almost facsimile edition of a facsimile version of an edition that focused on the look and feel of an original artifact, and then a digital version that had all the apparatus, for example. So that was one trajectory that we took. But then it occurred to us that we had taken for granted the idea that the digital was one thing, that you sort of have a long history of print interfaces, and then bingo, one day people wake up and sort of pour the old wine into a new bottle called digital. And of course, the moment you think about it that way, you realize that we, depending on how you calculate it, we've had at least, 30 years of experiments in digital editions and interfaces to knowledge. And so then we got interested in how would we study the evolution of digital interfaces. And one of the problems, as all of you can imagine with this, is that digital interfaces don't leave a record quite the way that print editions do. You can't simply go to the library, look up the Index Juridicus, and find between your library and other libraries editions spanning hundreds of years, and then compare the way different features work, like the table of contents and other components. So we decided to try to identify 2 or 3 artifacts, for lack of a better term, that we knew had been around for a long time in sort of recent digital history and had evolved over that time, and then go out and see if we could find traces of their interface, and then begin to string those traces together and explore how they might have evolved. And that's what led us to Perseus, because Perseus Perseus is one of the longest continuous running and fairly well-funded projects. I'm sure the Perseus folks don't feel well enough funded, but compared to other ones, they've done fairly well. And of course, they've survived. They go back. The Perseus project goes back to before the web, which was particularly interesting to us. The other one, just parenthetically, that we chose to look at was the Gutenberg collection. So this gets back to the question about why and how to study interface. So that was my sort of introduction to how we got where we were, and maybe I'll pause a second and ask if people have any questions about the INK project. The INK is spelled I-N-K-E, and you can find the website at ink.ca. And then from there, you can actually get to a sort of blog that shows a number of our projects. But if there are any questions, I'll take some now, and then I'm going to shift on.
Doesn't look like anybody has has any questions, Geoffrey. So go ahead and go on.
Okay. I am going to pause periodically to give one of the things I've learned about these sort of distance conferencing is you sometimes just have to pause and give people a chance. So don't take that. And of course, that lets me sort of figure out what I'm going to say next. So now I want to talk about why to study interface. Interface design has been primarily studied as an issue of how to design new interfaces. There's relatively little historical awareness around interfaces and the evolution, though there is, depending on how you think of the issue, there is, of course, a rich and strong tradition of the history of the book, history of typefaces, history of book design, and so on like that. But it hasn't really sort of gathered itself as a self-conscious field, if you will. I think a major change is the publication recently of Johanna Drucker's book, Graphesis. She has for some time been arguing that we need to pay attention to visual forms of knowledge production because she herself comes out of a design background. She's a book artist, and I think more than most people in the digital humanities has a very good sense of the crafts and arts and history of book design and has brought that into interface design. And I recommend her book, Graphesis. It's from this new imprint out of Harvard. Very approachable, very visual book. Just sort of wandering through it is a joy, just from the things that she's illustrated. But she makes a number of points that have been made elsewhere about the general reluctance by humanists to look at interface. She points out that this is partly due to a sort of the logocentrism of the humanities, which are fields that have grown out of, if you will, the word and not out of the view. I think she points out that interface design is not taken that seriously in the digital humanities. If you read interface design literature, you find that this is not just true of the digital humanities. A general complaint whenever you read sort of introductions to interface design is that the interface design is always added at the very end. The design of products is seen, first of all, as an engineering problem, and then you sort of add the sizzle to the steak afterwards. And this betrays an underlying assumption that there is a strong difference between form and content. The content is the real meat, the form is the sizzle, and the form is ephemeral and malleable, and you can always fix it later on. We see this prejudice to some extent in one of the great projects of the digital humanities, which is the Text Encoding Initiative. That project, or those guidelines, are premised on a division between appearance and structured content. And if any of you have gone to Text Encoding Initiative workshops, nowadays I think they're a little bit subtler than the early ones, but there's usually an emphasis early on to thinking about document analysis and thinking about a document in terms of its eternal structure as opposed to its immediate appearance in any particular rendering. This division between appearance and structure is, of course, facilitated by the technology. And to be fair, it's a very useful distinction. Like all distinctions, it fails in all sorts of interesting ways, but it has been very useful, especially in times of flux. In fact, for the Perseus project itself, encoding the text as TEI encoded text has allowed it to sort of reposition and adapt the project over time without having to always go in and mess with the content. Nonetheless, I think we see in this fundamental intellectual assumption of the Text Encoding Initiative and XML more generally, we see we see we see an assumption that there is an appearance that can be separated from the structure, where structure is things like chapters and paragraphs, things that are seen as important to content, and appearance would be the things that make it pretty, like typeface, layout, and so on. So at this point, I want to sort of say, given this predilection or this logocentricity to the digital humanities, the moment we start thinking about interface, we have to actually make the case for studying interface at all. And one way to make the case is to actually do it. But another way is to draw attention to the assumptions, the logocentric assumptions. But once you sort of accept the problem, then the question is how to do it, because we don't have the traditions of studying interface that we have, for example, for studying narrative or other aspects, or argument or sophistry or other aspects of verbal documents. So at this point, I want to talk about how we've set about studying interface. In some sense, you have already heard part of the answer in my discussion of the Ink project, in that one of the ways that we set about doing studying interface is to try to look at change in interface. So, if you will, one of the problems we always have when we want to study something is to try to separate the baggage we bring to an issue from the issue itself. And one way to separate your assumptions or to question your assumptions is to look at the history of something and try to use that to dislodge any assumptions that the way things are done now are the way they should be done. And as I mentioned before, we set about trying to look at the evolution of different interfaces. So I'm going to go on to the next slide here. So in the Perseus project, we set out to try to see whether or not we could reconstitute a history of its interface. And this is in many ways a story of failure, because as any of you who've tried to study the evolution of digital works, especially computer games, have discovered, we aren't doing a very good job of preserving the capacity to interact with digital works over time. Digital works are very dependent on the operating system, the platform, the hardware, such that 5-10 years later, it can be extremely hard to get access to, for example, a HyperCard stack or a game designed for a game platform that is no longer easy to access. And this was true. This is doubly true of the web, because websites evolve as projects evolve, and it can be very hard to get access to what the website might have looked like before. We ended up having to use the Wayback Machine, and this was also when we got in contact with the Perseus project. We first figured out, we sort of went through the Wayback Machine and other, just Googled for images and stuff like that, and tried to reconstitute a sort of tentative history of the Perseus project, primarily focusing just on its on the homepage and how the interface of the homepage changed over time. And we were able to build a tentative history which was wrong. Of course, in all sorts of ways, we were getting images from here and there, and we were missing parts and stuff like that, which is why we went back and we ran a series of interviews with people involved in the Perseus project. And what you're seeing here on this slide is a sort of one of our reconstitutions of the history. The numbers on the left, P1, P2, P3, these are sort of the different, what look to us like different versions. In fact, they don't always correspond to what Perseus called different versions, for reasons that will become interesting. And then on the far right, you can see some of the places where we found information. For example, just Google images. We got stuff from Perseus itself when we began to interview them. They gave us access to stuff. The Wayback Machine was very important early on, but eventually it's sort of flawed in many ways. We got CD-ROM versions through interlibrary loan. Even though they're very hard to run, they're still floating around in the system. And then, of course, at the very bottom, we've got the current website. So the first step is really to try to reconstitute a history of the different versions of the artifact. So in answer to the question of how to study an interface, our answer was to try to understand the change in the interface. And to do that, we had to document different versions. As any of you who have been web developers know, there isn't always a clean divide between one version and another. Even the issue of just naming something a different version is itself an interface design choice, and people don't always make it for the purposes of future scholars. They sometimes use numbers for other reasons. So this led us to a more nuanced approach. You know, once we had a tentative history, this led us to what we're calling an inferences approach. So we had a set of screenshots, and we had some tentative information. This was before we started interviewing. So what we did is we went through these, and we developed a framework of questions to ask about the change in interface. And on the left here, I'm showing some examples of questions that we would ask, and on the right you can see the framework. It's actually a matrix. In a second I'll show you the matrix. But the point of the framework was to prod us to ask questions about all the different things that could change in an interface, and all the different reasons why the changes might happen. So in terms of some of the things that could change, we paid special attention to what I'm going to call repeating elements. You know, the web or the interface equivalent to headers and footers. Another very important thing was the navigation strategies. Those could take the form of navigation panels, but also you have embedded links and so like that. We paid attention to any tools that were provided, search, you know, a search tool, stuff like that. We also paid attention to appearance, the typeface design, the images that were being used, the layout of the screen. So those were the sort of interface elements. And then in terms of asking questions about why something might have changed, we sort of boiled it down to, you know, did something change because of a change in technology? And the answer often is yes. Did something change, and this is subtler and harder to try to figure out, did something change because of changes in user expectations or user demands of a product? And that, of course, is almost a double inference, because we're trying to infer a design decision by the project, which in turn is an inference on their part about a change in user needs or user demands. A third thing, which proves sort of interesting, is changes in self-representation. How does the project change the way it presents who it is who created this project? And when I sort of walk you through a sort of potted history of Perseus, you'll see some examples of that. And then also more largely, we drew up inferences about changes in the political and economic structure of the project. You know, a prime example of that is, you know, some new element will pop up. It looks to us like this was you know, Perseus got a fancy grant from somebody to build something for the K through 12 market, or the Olympics were coming along and they wanted to sync something to the Olympics. So these are all the sorts of inferences that we might make. And to step back, so we developed these inferences, and you can see here the sort of matrix of stuff. We didn't develop inferences for every cell, you know, from one version to another. Things, you know, some things change, some things don't change. But we developed a set of inferences and questions about each new interface, and then we contacted the Perseus project and just went through them in a series of Skype calls and something like that. We sort of went, well, you know, we're wondering, why did you add this feature here? Why did you do this? We inferred from the thing that you guys got a big grant. Is that true? So we had the good fortune that the Perseus project was willing to collaborate, and more importantly, were actually honest with us. This is not a project that, you know, neither Greg Crane nor Lisa Serrato is who we worked with very closely. Were people who were, you know, trying to hide anything, or at least as far as we could tell. So I'm going to stop here and pause and ask if there are any questions about this inferential approach to trying to understand the evolution of an interface.
Well, I think oh yeah, Jens. I'll repeat his question. So this is Professor Jens Herze, who's the co-teacher. He's in theology, so he has a question.
Yeah. Well, my question would be, you know, how you interact with the users of Perseus in order to improve the interface.
Did you talk to I guess so the question is how was the interaction with the users of Perseus in order to produce to improve the interface? Was that one of the categories you looked at, and was that an inference that you tried to make, and was that something that you discussed then with the Perseus people, whether it was a user response or was that not one of your categories?
It was one of our categories. So the second one here, we did not interact directly with users, at least not in this project. There was a different little sub project which I hadn't planned to talk about, but I can talk about. In this one, we were going through, you know, in some sense, the users don't exist because we were looking at historical interfaces, and you'll see when I walk through them, these are interfaces from the 90s, mostly. So, if you will, those users don't exist because we're no longer in the 90s. There are obviously people who were there and were users at the time. But what we did do is that once we tried to separate the way we did our thinking to first just looking at the interfaces, using this framework to come up with a series of questions and a series of hypotheses or inferences. And then we interviewed mostly Lisa Serrato, but to a lesser extent Greg Crane when we could get him on Skype. And we asked them about their interaction with the users. And in fact, one of the things that came out, and we have a draft paper that I'm happy to send along if somebody wants, is that they did some user studies. And so, you know, we had interesting conversations with Lisa about the user studies and their perceptions of their users, which were not always based. In the 1990s, people were not doing a lot of formal user studies. So some of their perceptions were more based on emails they would get and stuff like that. And I think I might even have some examples to mention where they were getting feedback from users that led to design decisions. And I think I'll be able to show some examples of how that played out. We did not, in this case, interview users ourselves, and that would be an interesting direction to go, especially with something like Perseus. There's probably a population of classics teachers or people who even studied classics with Perseus when they were in school, and one could probably, with a certain amount of energy, find people and get them to retrospectively, if you will, reflect back on how they encountered Perseus, what it looked like back then, and how they used it. There is one other source of information which we've been trying to gather, but we're not doing a great job of it, which is documentation. You know, so there are manuals on how to use Perseus and stuff like that. Some of that material is right in Perseus, and one can make inferences about users that way too. So I don't know if I have answered your co-instructor's question.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think that did answer the question. I have a quick. I don't know if it's a really quick question, but why did you do it? Perhaps you talked about this and I just missed it. Why did you do inferences first and then go talk to the Perseus people, as opposed to talking first about what changes they made and then to go find those things in the record?
Well, I think our so some of it is historical accident in the sense that we were bumbling along. We were trying a number of different approaches, and drawing up inferences is something that we could do ourselves without needing the cooperation of Perseus. More importantly, I think we felt it was important for us to establish a certain distance. Initially, I didn't want to interview or collaborate at all with Perseus, not because I didn't like the Perseus people, but it just seemed to me if we were going to do a sort of clear-eyed look at the evolution of the interface, I didn't want to, in some sense, have my views of what was going on contaminated by collaborating with the Perseus team. And I think we thought initially that we could do the study independently. In fact, the first paper we gave at the DH conference in Stanford, we had done completely independently. And but it became clear that we couldn't get access. There's so little stuff, and the Wayback Machine is so idiosyncratic in terms of what it has. It became clear that we had to collaborate. And in addition, when we gave the paper at Stanford, Greg Crane was in the audience, and he said, "This is great. We'd love to collaborate." So then we shifted our practices and realized that okay, we can still maintain a certain intellectual independence and integrity, but do something akin to oral history. To be fair, I want to take it a step further and say we've gone beyond just oral history. This became a collaborative project that in order to get, and you'll see when we get down to the bottom, the end of this talk, when I'm talking about archiving, it has to be collaborative because we just don't have access to some of the early systems. Lisa Serrato has an old Mac Plus with the first HyperCard version, maybe not quite the first. She has to, to build a proper archive, we have to work with her. So that's I don't know if that's a good reason for why we did it, but that's a truthful reason.
Yeah, I think truthful makes it good. It's historically accurate. Let's put it like that. So that's good. Okay, good.
I think there's another aspect to that question, of course, is we have the luxury of being able to collaborate. If any of you have tried to look at websites, tried to study the interface of websites or projects that have disappeared, you'll know that that you don't always have the luxury of being able to collaborate or to find the designers. And so we need to develop approaches to studying interface that are capable of being done after the fact when you couldn't talk to or collaborate, or in situations where you're trying to study the interface of something where they won't collaborate. I've been doing a project where I'm looking at some of the slides that Snowden leaked a set of slides about a Canadian that showed screenshots of a Canadian tool used for spying on the Brazilian Ministry of Mines and Engineering, and we've in some ways been doing a very similar study of these screenshots. You know, what can we infer about this surveillance tool based on the slide deck that has been shared by Snowden? It's sort of paleography, PowerPoint paleography or something like that. And in this case, even if CZIC did want to collaborate with me, I don't think I would want to collaborate with them. I really, this is meant to be, that project is meant to be critical. And I'm sure what I would have to sign to see the working system, I would not be willing to sign.
Good, excellent. All right.
So now I'm going to actually just walk you through a somewhat abbreviated version of the Perseus, sort of history of the Perseus project to give you a sense of how this works. What you're looking at here is the HyperCard version of Perseus. Developed, you know, some of the early things were developed in the late 1980s. In fact, my first encounter with Perseus was when I was at the 1989 ACH LLC conference in Toronto, and this was the first joint conference between the Association of Computing and Humanities and the Association of Literary Linguistic Computing, the first joint conference that eventually became our big international DH conference. The conference, it was in Toronto, it was enormous. Ted Nelson talked, Northrop Frye talked at this conference. They had, and they had an enormous exhibit hall, and I was there exhibiting my little, I had built a set of HyperCard bibliographic management tools and note-taking tools, and I happened to be right across from Ellie Malonis, who was showing some of one of the early versions of Pandora, which allowed you on a Macintosh within HyperCard to search the TLG. And even though it wasn't a formal part of Perseus, it was part of the larger Perseus project. So what you're seeing here dates from about 1992, which was when Perseus, the first version of Perseus was sold. It was sold by Yale University Press. It ran in HyperCard on the Macintosh. It came with a CD-ROM. There was also a video disc. For more money, you could buy a video disc. And for those of you who are interested, I can, if you ask me, I can talk a little bit more about video discs. They had a very interesting, there was a very interesting moment in which video discs were the way that large image collections were being distributed in the digital humanities and beyond. And that was the way this one worked. You know, in terms of our framework, one of the main things about this interface is it was constrained by the technology of the Macintosh. The Macintosh at the time had a 9-inch screen. It was black and white. It wasn't even capable of shades of gray. So it was, by today's standards, a very crude window into the knowledge that was there. HyperCard, on the other hand, even though it was, by today's standards, perhaps a crude tool, HyperCard was an extremely popular authoring tool for people in the digital humanities. One little factoid I'd remember, HyperCard was released in 1986. It came for free on every Macintosh until eventually other companies got Apple to kill it because it was so popular. HyperCard, within a couple years of the first version coming out and being available on the Macintosh, somebody counted something in the neighborhood of 200 HyperCard stacks just for learning Arabic. It was a very accessible hypermedia authoring system that allowed all sorts of people, myself included, to get started in building digital works and then distributing them. It obviously was not as popular as the web was a little bit later, but it was, for its time, it was a very popular environment. Jumping ahead, we can now see this is one of the first web interfaces. And you can see how they've carried over this sort of idea of a panel similar to what was there on HyperCard. In HyperCard, you built stacks of cards, and effectively, when you were programming or authoring, you basically created buttons from one card to another. The way on the web, we create sites of pages, and we create links from one page to another. In HyperCard, you didn't have any scrolling around. It was one card. This card was screen size. But the whole card look carries over to the web version, even though the web doesn't need to have this sort of card orientation. So here you see a combination of sort of technology influencing the new design, but also, if you will, we can make some inferences about expectations of the users, that they're expecting the users to want to see something similar to what they saw in HyperCard. A couple of other things that we see in this design is we see the first instance of this running figure, which becomes the sort of graphic logo for the Perseus project. We also see the use of color. In fact, one could almost say an excess of color, because now they're freed from the Macintosh platform, which was black and white, and they can begin to use color. And we see this funny web design, which we see for a while in the Perseus project, where they have this opening panel that is reminiscent, and it is, to use a sort of web design phrase, the panel is what would be above the fold, what you would see when you first connected with your normal web browser. But there is more stuff if you scroll down, and the amount of more stuff actually grows over time. We then see the Perseus project gets a very different graphic design. This time sort of using a image of Delphi as a sort of background image. This is a much more sophisticated design, if you will. There's a sort of extruded, the Perseus project itself is a 3D extruded phrase there. This design, when we interviewed Lisa Serrato, this design was actually due to their hiring a designer. And this design was partly designed to work for both the web version and for a CD-ROM, a multi-platform CD-ROM version. I'm just going to jump ahead a slide to show you that multi-platform one. So you can see this is what the CD-ROM that was designed to be installed in either a Mac or a PC. So they were creating a multi-platform CD-ROM version because that was still important to a lot of schools and so on. And they were trying to create a sort of continuity of interface between the web version and the other version. Talking to the people at Perseus, there were some interesting issues around search, and this is where we learned from the Perseus people we were interviewing about user expectations. They had sort of two emerging audiences. On the one hand, they had the academic audience that was wanted a very narrow search, one that would not come up with lots of results, but would give you very specific results, allowing you to get to a particular passage or something like that. But they also had a growing school audience, especially for the web version, and they tended to want much more Catholic or inclusive results. And so they had to develop a two-tiered search, which would first give you the sort of more narrow focused results, but then if you search for something more generally for which there wasn't a focused result, it would sort of do a full text search and give you anything that seemed relevant. At the same time, we're seeing around now is when various search tools are coming online for the web, and the audience's expectations for how search works are changing. And I think this is something that would be interesting to do further study on, not just for Perseus, but for web design in general. The extent to which nowadays the success of the one button, one field Google fairly smart search, the extent to which that has influenced the search systems in all sorts of other environments. I remember taking classes in the 80s about how to do Boolean searching for CD-ROM indices and something like that. And the library and information science community was very keen on, training people to understand how to do searches. Well, Google has upended that whole thing. And they, rather than training us to understand Boolean searches, they have done a great job of anticipating what it is we really wanted and allowing us just to type in a whole mess of words if we want to narrow things down. And then providing really smart ways of ranking and ordering the results when they come in, and there are too many of them. So I just give that as an example of something, of a sort of user expectation. Here we see, as I mentioned, the dual, multi-platform PC and Mac CD-ROM. This comes out a lot later, but you can see it's still the same interface. Now, jumping ahead, around the same time that this dual interface comes out is when we see a major change to the Perseus interface, at least on the web. And this change, we spent some time sort of wondering about this change. Anyone who's done web design knows that that central area above the fold is the single most important area. And all of a sudden, Perseus, instead of putting a pretty picture of Delphi, is putting a map and a timeline in that location. In addition, I mentioned before in our framework that one of the things we looked for was self-representation. Before this, the project had been called the Perseus Project. Now, all of a sudden, it's called the Perseus Digital Library. And parenthetically, you see the return of the little running figure. But the name has changed, and we've got new stuff in the middle there. We also have announcements is loud and clear in the middle there. And so we went back and forth on why this was happening. Our inferences at the time were that essentially the project had acquired new text collections that really went beyond the classical world. And in fact, we were right. I mean, and the map and the timeline were designed to show that, and designed to alert users that, look, this is now no longer only about the classical world. We happen to have a bunch of Renaissance materials and materials about the New World. And when we talked to the folks at Perseus, it turned out that some of this was due to a series of grants that they got. So they got quite a significant amount of funding, in the millions of dollars, and this had a profound effect on the transformation of the Perseus project. The National Endowment for the Humanities, the NSF began to fund them, and I think they made what we call an ontological change, and by that we mean a change in terms of what things they thought they were providing access to and how they presented that. It also created a whole series of interface problems for them because they had an audience that was used to using Perseus for teaching about the classical world, and all of a sudden, bingo, they're providing these somewhat unrelated Renaissance and later collections. So they needed to alert us to that, and that's why on the left there you see that they provide ways for people to get back into what they expected. If you want to just get the classics, click here. If, on the other hand, you want to go to that cool project about the history of mechanics, click there. If you want some of the new stuff about the English Renaissance, click there. If you want London, click here, so on, so on, and so on. And then they even have some stuff about the history of Tufts. And you see an about there that actually gives a sort of justification for this new interface. And the last interface I want to show is really the most recent one. Oops, sorry about that. Which is, and this is an interface which is constantly changing. So I think we grabbed this particular snapshot in 2013. but this interface basically dates back to 2003. So this interface with variations has is the one that is the most common. I should say one other thing about the Perseus. One of their other solutions, which I can't really demonstrate either here, one of their solutions to the expectations of users who were used to using the old interface was to concurrently run two versions. And they actually ran a sort of old interface and new interface for a while, just so that the high school teachers that were emailing them complaining about changes could just use the old version and not worry about the new stuff. But that, eventually they were able to get rid of that and move on to this interface. This interface, in some ways, is a non-interface. The key, this is a case where there was a technology change, but the technology change was in the background, not in the foreground. There was a major re-engineering of the underlying engine that fed texts, because the project, like any scholarly project, it had been sort of running on bits of code cobbled together, and stuff moved from HyperCard over to Toolbook, over to the web, and the time came when, according to the Perseus folks, they really needed to go back and redesign the back. And you actually see that in the very top here when they talk about the Perseus hopper. So the hopper is sort of the back end that holds all this content. And as part of the hopper, there were also a lot of APIs, a lot of different materials in there, and they began to recognize that a bunch of people were actually just bypassing the front page and going straight into whatever it is that they wanted. So the home page, if you will, began to take on less importance. But they did want to keep on the home page. One of the things they did keep was a sort of popular text. This is somewhat like if you go to Amazon or something like that, what are people looking at right now? And they wanted to keep some of the art, the various exhibits, like the Hercules ones that were very popular and which had been grant funded. But they were also recognizing that more and more, given the size of the amount of material in Perseus, most people were just coming in and searching it and then going to directly what they wanted. Interestingly, and I don't know if this was, how deliberate a decision this was. I don't think it was necessarily a design decision in the sense of involving an interface designer. The central hotspot is devoted now to updates. And we've had a number of conversations about why that became important. Why did the homepage almost become a news channel? To what extent does that reflect the importance of blogging at this time? And we don't really have a good answer for this, but to some extent, when we interviewed the folks at Interface, their answer was they were focusing on getting the underlying technology working, and eventually they will think more about the front-end interface, and this is good enough. They have an audience that already knows how to get to their stuff, and so be it. So at this point, I'm going to stop my discussion of the sort of evolution of the interface. I'm going to pause now and take some more questions.
We actually had one of the students asked an interesting question on Twitter. Do we know when Perseus stopped being pure HTML? When did it become more than just HTML? Was that here in 2003 or when?
That's a good question, and I don't know. I think it's sometime before that. Certainly, the HyperCard version was not the Toolbook version. I doubt was, but it was probably the case that because the TEI was becoming very important in the 90s, it was probably the case, and especially where documents were being shared with Perseus, I'm guessing they began to both get texts in TEI XML. This is just a guess, by the way. And secondly, I'm guessing probably the key moment was this one. So I think right here, this is from the sort of paper we wrote in 2003. So 2005, Perseus was hacked. Let me think about it. No, so yeah, so I'm guessing, so it was Perseus 3 and 4 in some sense were running concurrently until about 2005. I'm guessing around 2000 is when they begin to build, switch things over to XML. In fact, I'm just guessing that, but I'm guessing that they're actually doing something interesting with the map and the timeline. But that's a good question, and I will actually ask them. That's also when they got some of the large grants that probably would have paid for re-encoding stuff and so on. But it was the hack of 2005 that led to, according to talking to Lisa Serrato, led to, in a sense, ditching Perseus 3 and going with the new Hopper version.
Okay.
Other questions?
I think that was it. I think that was all the questions that we have now.
Okay, so now I'm going to do something very different. So I talked about, I sort of talked about how we've been trying to study the history of the interface, but in our interface design group, as the title suggests, we don't just simply look at what has evolved, we also have tried to imagine what's going forward. And as part of as part of an answer to your colleague's question about user studies and so on like that, one of the things that we did, I was not planning to talk about it, but I have a sort of representation of it here for other purposes, is we did a SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We did a SWOT analysis of the current Perseus interface. The way we did that is we sort of built a chart, what you can see here, which is we identified landmark and representative pages. Landmark pages are pages that you have to go to, like the home page. They don't necessarily have any content. And representative pages would be pages that are representative of the content in the site. Then we sort of took, you can find a number of sort of published rubrics for what makes for good design. We took some of the sort of standard rubrics and just sort of, asked ourselves, is there a header, is there a subheader, is there a button to the home, is there navigation, that sort of stuff. And then we also looked at who this would be useful for. We had a conversation with Perseus and asked them who they thought their audience was. And then, for each one of these types of pages, we sort of made a determination ourselves about what, whether or not this would be accessible to a youth audience or not. And you can sort of see that in this chart here. There's more to the chart. I just show this, but it's in effect a sort of audit. It's a fairly standardized way of auditing a website. But that audit was partly designed just to figure out what was strong and weak. But as part of our audit, we also were doing a certain amount of reading about where interfaces were going. And one of the things that has shown up over and over again is that increasingly youth are accessing websites through mobile devices, whether they're tablets or smartphones. And this is even more true outside of North America than it is in North America. And in addition, there's more and more sort of projects, sort of smart schools that are issuing iPads and other tablets to students. So it became clear to us that if one were to ask the question, where should Perseus be going, Perseus needed to start thinking about mobile interfaces, especially if they wanted to continue to be accessible to the youth and the student audiences. And in addition, when we were looking at talking to Greg Crane has identified in a number of talks and to us personally that he considers, I'm probably not going to get this right, but he considers philology as an opportunity for international dialogue and is very interested in connecting to audiences, student audiences outside of the first world, people in the Arab, people who are very interested in the classical world and the classical languages. One example he gave in a talk was the number of people in Egypt studying Greek and Latin. And so these are audiences that he's identified as increasingly important, and the research tells us that they tend to be less likely to have the sort of large screen desktop machines that we have and more likely to be accessing information over smartphones or other mobile devices. So all of that led us to do some research to first figure out, what are the statistics, but more importantly, to start prototyping and imagining what a mobile Perseus interface might look like. And what I'm going to do in a second is I'm going to show two different sort of screencasts of some ideas that we prototyped. I want to, before I show these, I want to explain that they are very crude and they are deliberately crude. One of our sort of design principles, if you will, is not to make decisions about some of the appearance issues until later on in the process, to try to first identify the stakeholders, identify the potential audience, identify what the audience would use the environment for, and prototype that crudely, and not try to get anyone attached to the sizzle or the typography or the visual design. So we make things that are deliberately fast and crude. In this particular case, we've been using an environment called Balsamic because it's web-based. It allows you to quickly, sort of drag and drop and draw different interfaces, and then we can animate them, and we can share that with different people, including the Perseus project. So I'm going to show the first one. After a lot of discussion, we sort of came up with two possible mobile interfaces. The first one is, so at this point I'm going to switch and be running a little animation which hopefully will run adequately. If it begins to choke and so on like that, Matt, I hope you will stop me and make loud barking noises or whatever it takes.
I will bark very loudly, I promise. Okay, so what we had tried to ask ourselves is how could an instructor, a teacher, actually, in a sort of high school situation, how could a teacher use Perseus with their students? And we imagined a sort of sign-out model. Your mobile device typically doesn't have the space to hold all of Perseus, but we imagine a model where the instructor has students sort of sign out, in this case Medea, and they get images, they get text, they can get side-by-side Greek and English. They can, the students can read it on their mobile device. They can annotate it, write notes. They can listen to an audio version of it. They can see a video version and so on like that. This is not a particularly innovative interface, except because there were, especially in the early days of HyperCard and so on like that, there were all sorts of people exploring these types of multimedia interfaces to traditional editions. Even now, there are some beautiful examples of this for
mobile devices. If you're interested in seeing some neat examples, there's a British publisher who's been doing some, including one about T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, which combines the full text, page images of manuscripts. I'm not sure about how much of the manuscripts they have, but then they have various performance versions, including I think one of Eliot reading it, but then a contemporary performance version. So you get all these different multimedia versions combined in one. And so we tried to sort of borrow ideas from that because this is also material, a lot of this material is in Perseus already, and we imagine how that might be repackaged so that a student might go, connect, download a particular cluster of materials, read it on their pad, and then come into class and talk about it. So that's our first interface prototype idea. The second one is based on the idea of location, because one of the things about smartphones is, of course, that they are, many of them have GPS. So we're trying to imagine what something would look like if you had your iPad or your smartphone and you were wandering around Athens or something like that. And so we've called this touristy. As I said, it's a very crude animation, but the idea is that you could see what objects Perseus knows about in the vicinity. Now, castles is probably not a good example, but temples, archaeological sites, possibly even places of interest. You could sort of see that somewhere near you was an interesting battle. In this case, the image is a battle is not a classical battle, but you could see what texts and information that Perseus has about this location. It'd be interesting to think about the type of data mining you'd have to do to make sure that Perseus was capable of exposing the right stuff. And we also imagined a more crowdsourcing image feature where people with their iPhone or iPad could take a picture and contribute it of the object and contribute it back to Perseus. So there you see these two prototypes of what Perseus might think about if they wanted to go forward to build mobile interfaces to the content that they currently have. And I'm going to stop here now and pause and let people ask a question or two.
It looks like they're all amazed, speechless by the fantastic mobile mock-ups that you've done. Yes, the question.
Are there already users of Perseus that come from the Vedic application?
So the question is whether there are already users of Perseus who are not academics, so who are not in the university or are not professors. So, yes, the answer is yes. I don't know if you want to say more about that, Geoffrey.
No, go. You had a second part to the question. Sorry.
Yeah, the question was whether there are users of Perseus. Are there already users of Perseus who are not academics? And while the answer is yes, do we know of a percentage? Are there more academic users than non-academic users, or is it already tipped to where high school students and the general public is using Perseus more?
I don't know the percentages. What I do know is in our conversations with the Perseus project, they have a significant number of high school users, including teachers, because they got back when they made the switch from here to here, they got a whole mess of emails. So I don't think they know numbers, but they got a sort of explosion of people complaining about the change in interface because they were using materials to teach. So That is so that's one piece of evidence that they shared with us. They also got grants to actually build educational materials. They built some materials when I think around when the Olympics were. What year were the Olympics in Athens? 2000, something like that. They built materials specifically for understanding the ancient Olympics that people could weave into the curriculum. And that's one reason why these things actually still stick out as buttons, because these materials were sort of customized for a youth audience, younger kids. So that then a second part of the question is what I'm going to call an aspirational audience. Greg Crane has, and that's what this initial interface idea is for. Greg Crane has, in a number of papers and to us personally, has made an argument that philology and the study of the classical world could be a place for intercultural dialogue. And it's a two-part argument. One part of the argument is to the effect that we can involve all sorts of people, especially students, in research. So even university students and high school students can be involved in a meaningful way in research activities. What he has in mind and what he's described when he talks about this is for example, students doing morphological tagging or crowdsourcing translation and so on like that. That you could bring students into actually enriching resources, and neither of our interfaces addresses that. That's actually a very interesting separate interface question. But there's been a lot of research about how crowdsourcing is a way of, there hasn't been a lot of research, but there's been a number of interesting projects about how crowdsourcing is a way of bringing a larger public into research activities. And one of the first projects to try to crowdsource research was the name of it is the I want to say Stow Online. It's not the Stow Online. It's the large sort of encyclopedic Greek Byzantine text, which was translated by community translators, undergraduates, high school Greek teachers, all sorts of people. Instead of having a proper academic project that would have never been published, they set it up so that people could sign out a paragraph or two of text, translate it, and they got extraordinary participation from the non-academic public, if you include in that undergraduates, high school teachers, and stuff like that. So this is a case, and I think Greg Crane is inspired by that and other projects. The Bentham, transcribed Bentham project would be another example. He imagines using these materials and their enrichment as a way of bringing a much larger audience, multicultural audience in. So that's the first part of it, the crowdsourcing part. The second part of it is that he has a project, and you guys know more about this than I do, trying to figure out who is the classical world right now. And I think if my memory serves from the last time I looked at the website, it's not in North America. It's not in the English-speaking world. It's in, well, Italy is really big because, of course, it's still part of the, the traditional education in Italy. But the Arab world is very interested in learning about the classical Greco-Roman world. And I think, so that's what this interface is more aimed at, creating, it's aimed at giving Perseus a way of allowing people who have a different access to technology outside of the global north, giving them a way to use Perseus to learn on their own and to explore the classical world, especially given the interest in the example that Greg Crane has given, the interest in studying ancient Greek and Latin in Egypt. So that was a very long, roundabout answer to the question.
Okay, good. That was good. That was a good answer. We've got about 12 minutes left before I have to let the students go. So so hopefully we can finish in that time.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I'm at the very end. So
Sure.
I've been taking questions along the way. So the last thing that I just wanted to mention, and it's in some ways it's so obvious it doesn't need mentioning, is if we want to be able to study the evolution of interface, and through the evolution of interface be able to study the evolution of academic thinking and visual forms of knowledge, then we need to start preserving interfaces. We need to think about what it means to preserve them. And given the complexity of trying to preserve full-blown working interactive systems, we have developed a way of preserving. We have developed an alternative way of trying to preserve the key elements of the Perseus interface, and this is what you see here. And I'm just going to explain this a little bit. We are right now working with the Perseus project to create an archive that would be capable of being looked at and studied 100, 200, 300 years from now. The first aspect of the archive, of course, is some explanation about what this archive is about, which is what the README. Then we have, using that chart that I showed at the very beginning, we've sort of identified key moments in the interface when things change dramatically, and we are systematically going through and creating a sub-archive, if you will, of each one of these key moments. The first one we did is the most recent one, Perseus 4. For that archive, we keep metadata for the archive itself. We keep documentation where we can find it, blog entries, manuals. This is not the actual thing itself, but information about the thing itself. And then, of course, there is the interface archive itself. And for those of you who get into these types of really gnarly and interesting issues, you can imagine, how do you preserve the experience of an interface? And especially given how ephemeral things are. And so it comes down to, I mentioned that we had drawn up a list of representative pages. For each representative page, we are actually taking a screenshot. We are grabbing the HTML and all the associated files. We're saving it as a Mozilla archive file format. And then, of course, we're saving metadata about the thing. And that's essentially, imagine for some 50-odd pages for each version, we're trying to do this. We are also, I should mention in the documentation, we're saving movies that show how somebody would typically search or interact with stuff, because static images only give you so much information. And my final slides just essentially go over those details. Here's an example of some documentation, the Perseus 2 installation instructions and basic user guide. Here's the list of the different files that we drew up. Of course, they've changed over time, but we're trying to grab something like this for each one, so you can compare not just the home page, but you could compare a image page or something like that. When we snap pictures of the pages, we're actually saving them as PNGs. We have to stitch them together, but we're trying to save something akin to what it looks like on our screen now. That raises interesting issues about, what did it look like on the screen back then? And we haven't found a really good history of, average screen sizes and color resolution and stuff like that. But I'm sure somebody has one somewhere. And our metadata, this being digital humanities, we of course spent an immense amount of time coming up with a metadata scheme for each of those objects. So this is metadata for a particular page, information about rights and who did it, and then for each object here you see the screenshot. And that's the end of my talk. So I turn it over to you if there are some final questions.
Excellent. All right. So, yeah. Okay. Any questions? Final questions?
I have this picture of a computer game on the final screen because, in a sense, we are drawing on all the work that's going into the documentation and archiving of computer games. That is sort of the cutting edge, if you will, of interface history, because computer games are all interface and they're disappearing faster than we can figure out how to preserve access to them. In fact, one might argue that, you know, one of the great original contributions of the late 20th century to the history of human culture was the computer game, and it's all disappearing as one Nintendo NES after another becomes dysfunctional, and Nintendo, of course, doesn't allow anybody to create emulators, and so we're just losing that piece of history. And so we've been learning from that community that's trying to document and preserve that.
Okay, we do have one question.
Yeah, besides the development of the Perseus project for mobile devices, are there any ideas of, you know, to develop the web-based, the web page a little further? So is this a kind of an ongoing project, or?
Do you know about, have you also given, so the question was about the online version of the Perseus website, and have you done any interaction or interface suggestion, so to speak, mock-ups for the normal online site, or was all your energy only for the mobile?
This chart that I showed started, I mentioned the strengths, a SWOT analysis. So the SWOT analysis looked at, you know, what are the strengths of the current interface, the weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and we sort of outlined the things that we thought were an issue. We did not do any mock-ups because, you know, we gave that to Greg and Lisa, and their reaction to it was, "Oh, this is great." And one of the opportunities that we had mentioned was mobile, and that's what they were interested in. So that's what we decided to then do the research. What makes for a good mobile interface? What do we know about mobile users? And that. So we have not. I think we would be more than happy to contribute to interface design ideas for the main website, and there are a series of suggestions in that SWOT report. But you know, we don't want to impose on. They've got you know, Greg and others have you know, they have really good designers and all sorts of smart people. I don't think they need us to come up with incremental improvements. In fact, one of the main things I think we're focusing on right now is really documenting. You know, one thing that a project like Perseus doesn't have time to do is to document what they have done and where they've come from. So, but if Perseus asked us, I mean, we're a grant-funded project and our funding is coming to an end, but I know a number of the MA students here have gotten, you know, have thought long and hard about Perseus. I'm sure they'd be happy to mock things up.
Good, good. So I think that's it. So thank you very much, Geoffrey. It was, I think we were able to follow fairly well, and the video will also be available on YouTube later. I don't know how long it takes to actually get over there, but if you want to look something up or ask or figure out exactly what he said at some point, then you can always look at go back to YouTube and check it out. So, okay, so I'm going to stop the broadcast now, and then so thank you very much, Geoffrey.
Yes.